In this video, we're going to consider some more counterexamples to the other theses. So next, we're going to consider a counterexample to satisfaction. So let's first remember what satisfaction says. Satisfaction says that if the properties associated with the name, or if most of the properties associated with the name are uniquely satisfied by some person, then that person is the object picked out by the name. So for instance, if there's exactly one person who satisfies the properties associated with the name Kanye West, we know what those are, then the person who satisfies them, well, he's the meaning of the name, or he's the person the name is used to talk about. The way Kripke argues against this is that, well, it looks like we can imagine situations where, in fact, somebody else had most of the properties that we in fact associate with a particular name. And yet we wouldn't want to use the name to describe that person in that possible situation. In the text itself, Kripke uses this Gödel-Schmidt example to illustrate his point. I'm going to give you a slightly different example. We'll talk about both of them on Thursday, but it's good to have a range of different examples to think about. So let's think about Steven Spielberg, the director. As a matter of fact, most people know him as the director of movies like E.T., Jurassic Park, Indiana Jones. I could go on. So he's directed a load of films. And of course, being the director of those films is a description that would pick out Steven Spielberg uniquely. There's only one person who's done all those things, and that's Steven Spielberg. But imagine a situation like this. So this is probably not what happened in real life. This is sort of a kind of conspiracy theory about Steven Spielberg. But we can imagine a situation like this. Imagine a possible world where things had gone very differently, where in fact Spielberg didn't direct any of those movies. Rather, there was this other guy, Alan Smithee, and we'll imagine Alan Smithee directed all these movies, but Steven Spielberg took the credit for it. If we want to flesh it out, we can imagine maybe like Steven Spielberg is some sort of mob boss who intimidates everybody into silence, puts his name on the movie, and then goes out and takes all the credit for it. So in that situation, it's just simply false that Steven Spielberg is the director of all these movies. It's some other guy, this Alan Smithee guy, who directed all those movies. But let's now think for a moment about how we describe that situation. Would we describe that as a situation where somebody other than Spielberg directed all those movies? It seems like the answer is yes. We would want to say, well, in that situation, Spielberg didn't direct E.T., he didn't direct Jurassic Park, he didn't direct Indiana Jones. It was Alan Smithee who directed all those films. But that just doesn't look like something we could say according to the description theory. Because remember, what the description theory says is that, well, whenever those properties uniquely pick out a person, the properties associated with a name, then that is the person who has those properties, that's the person who that name picks out. So remember what we said about the meaning of the name Steven Spielberg. We said the descriptions associated with it are things like director of Jurassic Park, director of E.T., director of Indiana Jones. In this possible situation, who is the director of those movies? Is it Spielberg? No, we said it's this other guy, Alan Smithee. But that seems to be directly contradictory to what the description theory would say. What the description theory looks like it would say is, like, when we were talking about that situation, our use of the name Steven Spielberg would have to pick out the guy Alan Smithee. Because remember, it picks out whoever is the director of all those movies. That's a situation where the guy we call Steven Spielberg didn't do all those movies. He didn't direct all those movies. So it looks like the description theory is committed to this really weird claim that, in fact, that isn't a situation. We couldn't describe that as a situation where Steven Spielberg didn't direct all those movies. Because it's just part of the meaning of the name Steven Spielberg in the first place, that he directed all those movies. So we couldn't use the name to talk about a possible situation where somebody didn't do that. When we use the name Steven Spielberg, we would have to be talking about the guy I was calling Alan Smithee. And that looks wrong. It looks like it's perfectly okay to describe the situation, to use the name to talk about the guy who intimidates the actual director into silence. We can imagine a possibility where it's Steven Spielberg doing that, and where we would call the guy who does that Steven Spielberg. And that's not something it looks like you can do according to the description theory. So Kripke thinks the description theory must be wrong. Or in particular, this uniqueness thesis, which is part of the description theory, must be wrong. It's not the case that whoever has the properties associated with a name, that's the person the name talks about. We can imagine these situations where not only does the person who actually have those properties lack them, but rather somebody else has those properties. So like in this possible situation, Alan Smithy is a different person who has all the properties associated with Spielberg. But that doesn't want to make us think that, oh, really the name Spielberg refers to this guy, Alan Smithy. It refers to the guy who in that situation didn't direct all of the movies. One last way to bring out the intuition, this is the kind of thing that Kripke himself says about his Gödel-Schmidt example, is like, so think about the possible situation again, where the way we described it was Steven Spielberg turns out not to be the director, it's this other guy, Alan Smithy. Would you describe that as a situation where it turns out the name Steven Spielberg refers to a completely different person than the person you originally had in mind? It looks like the answer is no. The way you would describe it is that's a situation where somebody other than Steven Spielberg did all the things that Steven Spielberg is famous for. And that's something that just looks incoherent on the description theory. If the description theory were right, it just doesn't look like you could make sense of saying things like, somebody else did all the things that Steven Spielberg was famous for. Because all the things that Steven Spielberg are famous for, those are what makes the name Steven Spielberg mean that guy in the first place. So that's a big problem for the uniqueness thesis. Let's next consider the counterexample to the non-existence thesis. So let's remember what the non-existence thesis said. It said that, well, if the properties associated with a name don't pick out somebody uniquely, or something uniquely, then that name simply fails to refer. It cannot talk about any particular person in the world. And Kripke observes that it looks like there are plenty of cases where the associated properties fail to pick out something uniquely, and yet the name perfectly well refers to people. In fact, we kind of saw some examples of this originally, like arguably the Mozart-Beethoven examples are like this. If all you know is like classical composer, well obviously that doesn't pick out anybody uniquely, but it's still the case that Beethoven refers to the guy Beethoven and Mozart refers to the guy Mozart. But I'll give you one more example, just to really kind of bring it out. So think about the guy Charles Darwin. So what most people associate with Charles Darwin, if they really know anything about him at all, is that he developed the theory of natural selection. So you might have thought, like, you know, inventor of the theory of natural selection, that's something that picks out Darwin uniquely. But in fact, and it was sort of a big deal at the time, that actually somebody else at pretty much the same time independently came up with basically the same theory as Darwin. This guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with a theory basically identical to Darwin's about natural selection. So it turns out, arguably, the description, you know, the property inventor of the theory of natural selection does not uniquely pick out Charles Darwin after all. It also seems to maybe pick out this other guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. Now remember what non-existence says. So non-existence says if the property associated with the name does not pick out anybody uniquely, now that's compatible with it picking out, so there's more than one way for that to happen. It could pick out nobody, or it could pick out more than one person. Non-existence says in either of those situations, the name fails to refer to anybody. But that just looks wrong about the name Charles Darwin. You know, now that I've told you that Darwin was not the only person to come up with this theory, does that mean that we've just found out that the name Charles Darwin is meaningless, that it doesn't really refer to anybody? Obviously not. The name continues to be perfectly meaningful. And we would use it to describe what we had discovered. We would use it by saying things like, it turns out Charles Darwin was not the only person who came up with a theory of natural selection. This other guy did as well. And again, that looks like something we just shouldn't be able to say according to the description theory, because once we discover that there was no unique person who came up with the theory of natural selection, then it looks like we should have just discovered that the name never meant anything after all, or at least at this stage, the name doesn't mean anything in the end after all. That just isn't how we talk. That is just not how we would react to discovering that Darwin is not the unique person with this property. So again, it looks like uniqueness is false. We're perfectly well able to talk about things, even if we discover that the things we thought uniquely picked them out are actually shared by other people as well. And just as a side, but as the Mozart-Beethoven cases show, this also happens in cases where we never thought the properties were unique in the first place as well. The last principle we're going to consider a counterexample to is the a priori principle. So remember what that says. It says that for any name X, and the properties associated with it we're calling the phi's, we should be able to know a priori the sentence, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's. I.e., if there is somebody with that name, then the person with that name has the properties that are associated with the name in its meaning. And actually, again, the kind of examples we've already seen suffice to give a kind of counterexample to this principle. Because think back to our Steven Spielberg example. So we can think about situations where he lacks the properties that people tend to associate with him, and in fact somebody else had those properties. Now, probably we know that that didn't happen, or at least we should be very, very confident. As I said, it was kind of a conspiracy theory about Steven Spielberg. It looks like something that, there's really no evidence for at all. But on the other hand, is that something that we know a priori? Because remember what it means to say that we know something a priori. It means that we don't need any evidence at all. It's something that we can know by just sort of like thinking about the concepts involved. Can we know by just thinking about the concepts involved, by just thinking about Steven Spielberg and thinking about Alan Smithy or the movies or whatever? Is just thinking about these things and not having any knowledge about the world at all enough to know that that situation didn't happen? That there wasn't this guy who directed the movies? It looks like no. Probably we do know that that didn't happen, but we don't know it because we thought about it, we just thought about the concepts. We know it because we just know lots of ordinary things about the world. We know that that's not how the world works. But that's not at all knowledge a priori. We need a lot of substantial knowledge about the world to know that that thing didn't happen. I would argue we do have that knowledge. We do know enough to know that Steven Spielberg really is the director and there wasn't this other guy who he just took all the credit from. But that's not something we know a priori. Just thinking about the concepts themselves is not enough to be able to rule out that situation. And again, this is not what the principle a priority, this is not what a priority, this principle that comes from the description theory, would tell us. The description theory would tell us we don't need to know anything about the world at all to be able to rule out that situation, because it's just part of the meaning of the name Steven Spielberg that he is the director. We don't need to ask ourselves, could there be a situation where Steven Spielberg didn't direct all those movies? That would be kind of like asking ourselves, could there be a situation where a bachelor wasn't an unmarried man? It's just part of the meaning of the word bachelor that it means unmarried man. On the description theory, it's just part of the meaning of the word Steven Spielberg that he directed all those movies, just like it's part of the meaning of the word bachelor that it means unmarried man. So just as it would make no sense and that we can know a priori that bachelors are unmarried men, we should be able to know a priori that Steven Spielberg directed all those movies. But it isn't something it looks like we know a priori. We know it because we know various things about how the world works. So basically that completes Kripke's case against the description theory. And the arguments actually are really simple when you break it down. Because what he did was he just stated the theory really clearly, and then in each case just gave some counterexamples. We saw that the necessity principle failed. It's really easy to talk about people lacking the properties that we tend to associate them. It's perfectly fine to say things like Aristotle could have never taught Alexander the Great or done any philosophy or been a student of Plato. That should be incoherent if the description theory was true, but actually it's a perfectly sensible thing to say. It's very easy to imagine what it would take for that to be true. We've seen counterexamples to uniqueness. Uniqueness said that the properties that go with a name have to pick out somebody uniquely. We saw that there are lots of pretty normal examples where the only things we know about somebody and that we associate with their name are properties that lots of other people have too. For lots of people, all they'll associate with the names Mozart and Beethoven are that they're classical composers, but the property classical composer hardly picks out uniquely Mozart or Beethoven. We talked about satisfaction. So satisfaction was the idea that, well, whenever there is somebody who has most of the properties associated with the name, then that must be the person who the name picks out. And here, my version of the Gödel-Schmidt case was the counterexample to it. We can imagine situations where somebody else did all the things that Steven Spielberg is famous for. That doesn't mean that we would then discover in that situation the name Steven Spielberg refers to somebody else. Rather, we would say that's a situation where somebody other than Spielberg did all the things Spielberg is famous for. Or it could have been that Steven Spielberg didn't do any of the things he was famous for, rather this other guy, Alan Smithy, did. Again, according to the description theory, since it's just part of the meaning of the name Steven Spielberg, that he did all those things, that should be an incoherent thing to say. But we see that it isn't. We gave an argument against uniqueness. We saw that there are like real-life cases where it turns out that properties you might think uniquely pick out somebody do not. You might have thought, developed the theory of natural selection uniquely picks out Darwin. Turns out there was another guy who developed the theory at the same time. That doesn't show that the name Darwin is meaningless, but that's a problem for our non-existence thesis, which says that if the properties don't pick out somebody uniquely, then the name fails to talk about anybody. And finally, we saw a counterexample to the a priority principle, and the counterexample was exactly the same one given to satisfaction. We thought about my version of the Gödel-Schmidt example, the one with Steven Spielberg and Alan Smithy, and we saw that it doesn't look like you can know a priori that Steven Spielberg did all those things if he exists. It relies on to know that Steven Spielberg really was the director, that relies on actual things we know about the world. It's not enough just to rely on our concepts of the people involved. That's not enough to know that. So that basically concludes Kripke's case against the description theory. And you can see that, like, if Kripke is right against these examples, the argument is very, very strong. Because we isolated this long list of things that all seem to be part of the theory. Like, there were like 6 different principles that were part of the theory. Like, that really seemed like central to the idea that it was trying to get at. And what Kripke is trying to do is give counterexamples to all 6 of them. And that is part of why the argument is seen to be so strong. Because it's not like he just focused on one part of the description theory and tried to knock that down. Rather, he takes all of these central strands at once and tries to knock all of them down in turn. And that makes it much harder for the description theorists to reply. Because not only, it's not enough to just think that some of the counterexamples don't work. We will obviously talk about what you think about the counterexamples yourselves in Thursday, but some of these counterexamples people are not necessarily in agreement with Kripke about. But if you agree that the description theory is committed to the 6 principles that we saw counterexamples to, it's not enough to just disagree with a single counterexample. You have to disagree with all of them. You have to think all of them are mistaken. And that's exactly, I think, why people have thought Kripke's argument is so strong. Because while there might be some, you may quibble with some of the examples. Here, the Gödel-Schmidt example has actually gotten a lot of attention about whether people really think that's right. But to show that Kripke is wrong, you would have, and to show that the description theory is right, or that it can recover, you would have to discredit all of the counterexamples. And that does seem like a difficult thing to do.